Presence is often discussed as a must-have for leaders, and the higher you move organizationally, the more it seems to matter. So what is presence, and specifically, what is executive presence? That's the topic of our episode today. If you are serious about your growth and your career advancement and your overall ability to influence others, you are absolutely in the right place. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live and could do that on future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all that information about where and when you can join us live. And see these episodes sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. And with that, let me bring in our guest today. His name is Joel Garfinkle, and now you can see him. And now I'm going to introduce him. Joel is a recognized master executive coach holding the Master Certified Coach designation, and Global Gurus lists him 14th on their list of global coaching experts. He's the author of 11 books, including his latest, Executive Presence, and his interviews and articles on executive presence, career advancement, and leadership issues have appeared in HBR and the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, USA Today, Forbes, CNN, the New York Times, NPR, and now the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Joel, welcome. Sir.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here with you. Looking forward to it.
Oh, we've got a little bit of a delay. Which we didn't have before we went live, but there's a slight delay, but I think we'll be okay. I am glad that you're here, and I want to dive into this book. But I want to start by asking the question of what sort of led you to this work, sort of why this particular stuff.
You know, it's interesting. About 20 years ago, I saw a certain pattern to the clients I was working with, similar issues. And it was specifically, women, minorities, and introverts were being held back in their careers because they lacked executive presence. They came across as the theme I saw and the pattern I saw is they came across as tentative, quiet, too deferential. And I felt drawn to wanting to help these groups of people kind of own their power and presence and have more strength and lead with a stronger presence. And so that kind of started it all when I started to see that happen and realize that there's a certain process and a certain need here that I really wanted to fill.
Awesome. And the book helps us do that. We're going to dive into that in a second. You open the book with a quote from Walt Whitman that I absolutely love. And he said that we convince by our presence. And in the tease, in the open, I said, well, what is exactly presence? People ask me that all the time. So that's probably where we should start. Like, what do we even mean by presence?
Presence is really about how you show up. And so when you show up in the work environment, are you coming across and radiating a certain degree of what I would say is confidence and having confidence in most of your interactions, which means communicating with conviction and clarity, avoiding ambiguity when you're communicating with conviction and clarity. And it means being even a bold and decisive decision maker, coming across as professional and competent. So executive presence is really, you want to have a reputation for making things happen. And people will look at you and see, how are you showing up at work? Are you showing up with a strong presence? And how are you speaking? And how are you making decisions? All of that's being evaluated. And you want to be able to show that you're not just radiating gravitas, but you're communicating with a sense of authority. And you're also expressing yourself more fully. And that's really, key components of executive presence.
So I asked what is presence, and then you sort of quickly moved into executive presence, which of course is what we're talking about today. How would you define the difference? Or what is the difference between presence and then having executive presence?
So presence is basically how you show up. That's the bottom line is what I would say. It's how you're showing up, and when you show up, how are people not just perceiving you, but how are they receiving you? And so that's how you're showing up. That's presence. Then executive presence, which sometimes people get hung up on the word executive. So you could replace it with the word leadership if that makes it more inviting and accessible to you. So you could call it leadership presence at times. But so it's taking your presence and saying, okay, now with my presence, let's look at if I had to define what executive presence is. Am I telegraphing that I'm in charge, that I have confidence, that I come across as my words and actions kind of show that I know what I'm doing. I'm winning the confidence of those around me, and I'm showing that I can be in charge, and I'm a compelling force in the organization. I'm not passive. I'm not meek. I'm not tentative, but I'm showing up with someone who has a power and presence that people can feel, can recognize, and your imprint on the work environment is felt.
So obviously, the book is titled "Executive Presence," which is fantastic, and you've now talked about leadership presence, executive presence, which I think is helpful because not everyone says, "Well, I don't want to be in the C-suite," and
Right.
yet all of what we're talking about today applies. Whether we're an aspiring leader, whether we're a frontline leader, whether we're a leader of leaders, doesn't have to be in the C-suite for these things to apply. Agreed?
Absolutely. And I think I've worked with leaders who have been in the C suite, in mid level management, and even starting off in their career. They'll tell me that, oh, these executive presence concepts are relevant for me. And I've used them at different stages in my career. The thing I think you have to realize to shine as a leader with executive presence is you need to become someone who influences outcomes, trying to contribute to the decisions that are being made and drive some change. And so, no matter where you are in the organization, you don't want to wait for that to happen. You want to look at what ways can I leverage my influence to positively shape outcomes? How can I lean more into situations, whether it's projects, meetings, interactions I'm having with other leaders? How do I show up with someone who has something to say and has some level of influence and impact that I'm trying to make, no matter what my title or position is.
So the question people might be asking, and you talk about it early in the book as well, which makes sense, and that is like, okay, that all sounds good, Joel. How do I know if I have it? Like, do I have any of it already? There's a couple of questions here, but let's first just get at this sort of awareness of where we are now. How do we figure this out?
I think the key thing is one thing people have mentioned to me is, and then this gets to the model. I have a 3 by 3 model and I have 9 different competencies. And I lay this out really clearly in the book. And what people have found is that I can look at these 9 competencies and, we have gravitas, and underneath the gravitas column, we have, are you coming across as confident, commanding, and charismatic? And then under the authority column, which is the middle column, am I coming across as decisive, bold, and influential? And then the third column is expression. Am I expressing myself, which means the 3 competencies are, am I being vocal? Am I speaking up? Am I then being insightful? So when I am speaking up, am I coming across as insightful? And the third competency is clarity. Am I coming across as clear? Now, those 9 competencies, you could look at that model, that one sheet in the book, and it lays those 9 out and say, which ones do I do well and which ones can I do better? You can immediately evaluate your own executive presence and immediately come to a conclusion which ones you need to improve upon and which ones are you doing really well. And it's also something I've had people print out when they've emailed me and I sent them a PDF of it. They are able to take that and then share it with their manager, other leaders, and say, how do you perceive my executive presence? And that can be really powerful because then you get data from others that are giving you feedback on what you need to improve upon and what looks good and what doesn't, versus someone saying, well, executive presence, I don't know exactly what it is. It's too nebulous to me. I can't really define it. Instead, now you have a really clear definition of what it is. And that allows people to use it as a foundation to know what to change and what not to change.
So you've hinted at an answer here, but I think one of the things that I hear in working with leaders is some of the things you described, like charisma, and that's one of them I want to come back and talk to about more. But some people will even say just about presence in general, like, okay, I don't know if I have it, but I also know that you either got it, like this is genetic, like I either got this or I don't. You've now said it's competencies, so that kind of tells us the answer to the question. But like, how do you respond to people when they say, "Well, that's awesome. I wish I had it, but I don't got that stuff."
I say that, I mean, I wrote the book for people who don't have it, is really what I would say. And I would say that, some people have expressed to me, some of these competencies seem like that if you're more of an extroverted person, you're going to have some of these qualities. And I think there's some truth to that. And if you're more of an introvert, or you're someone who's maybe in the STEM fields, engineering, science, technology, math, or you're a little more shy, um, or you're sometimes people who are minorities. I found these groups have been drawn to the model because they're like, these are some of the competencies, gravitas, authority, expression, that I can see that I can actually do more of. And so it isn't something you're born with. It's something that I really feel that you can develop and you can improve. Some people have a leg up. Some people have a certain advantage automatically. But I find people in the work environment, when I do workshops, and I used to do a lot more before the pandemic, but when I did a lot of them, what I found is I always took a poll in the beginning. I said, how many of you consider yourself introverts? And I would say 80% to 85% would raise their hand. I was shocked by that. And we're talking rooms of like 80 to 100 to 150 people. And I think what I found is that on some kind of line, people have different degrees of introversion, but
Sure.
people could relate to having some part of introversion. And so then a lot of these competencies of, how do I show up more confident and commanding and charismatic and decisive, bold, influential? How do I do this when my tendency of my personality is to hold back a bit, is to withdraw a bit? And the key thing is you want to lean into that more and show up more and have more of a presence and be a more stronger, bolder leader. Ultimately, at some point in your career, you recognize that becomes more of a necessity, and you can't just rely on your competence and your performance to be good enough.
Well, that raises all sorts of questions, which some of which we'll get to in a minute. But I want to go back to something a minute ago, because you talk about this in the book, and I agree 100%. And I want to get into some of the competencies and some of those things. But one of the things, like, if Joel, you're telling me I need to be bold, I need to be commanding, and some of those things, and yet you say, man, we ought to be asking for feedback. So let's talk about that, because I think sometimes people are concerned in a leadership role, especially as they move higher. Like, I don't, asking for feedback makes me look weak. Asking for feedback makes me, maybe doesn't send the message I want to send, which I don't agree with. But talk to us about that, like the value slash importance of asking for feedback, not only in terms of what we get, but how it's perceived when we do.
Oftentimes people's fear, and I do hear this also, is that their fear is, what are people going to say? And sometimes I don't want to hear it, and I'm scared they're going to say something negative or something that I'm hesitant to want to hear. And the key thing I say is, well, the bottom line is they're already thinking it. You might as well know it. And so let's ask the question. And if you invite, and you have the model in front of you, you invite and say, hey, I really want to grow. I know this is an area I need to improve on. I really need your feedback and I want your support. That's very inviting. And now the person feels like, okay, I want to help you. And then the conversation becomes, one, give me the feedback. Great. Then the second question becomes, well, what can I do to improve this? And what would you be willing to do to help me improve this? So then it becomes, and what suggestions do you have for me to get better at executive presence or the certain competencies I want to work on? So now all of a sudden, you're not just asking for their feedback, you're enlisting their support. And then you're going to go and take their suggestions, go apply it, go back to them maybe a month later and say, hey, here's the suggestions you provided to me. Here's what I did. Did you notice? What do you think? Have you seen any improvement? Now all of a sudden it becomes a dialogue where maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people you're doing this with, all of a sudden you get some advocates who are actually engaged in wanting to support your development and actually are participating in helping you get better at something. And they're giving you suggestions and you're applying it and getting better. That's a very
And
hands-on
and they're
interactive
helping you be
approach.
accountable, right?
And they're
Because
holding you
now,
accountable.
like, once I ask for that and I say, "Hey, that's a good idea. I'm gonna do that different in meetings," and then I ask you, then like I gotta take action now. It's harder
Yes.
for me to step back and say, "Well, that was nice, but," or "I'm scared," or whatever, if I know that someone's watching and I know that
He
someone is trying to help me and I've engaged them in that way. I think it's super important.
and Kevin, the other thing I was just thinking of is that's important here is I often tell my leaders, I say, "Has anyone ever come to you and asked you for feedback?" And they always say yes. And I say, "What's that feel like?" They're like, "I like it. I like when people ask me and want my advice or want
And
my feedback."
do I feel how does that change my feeling about them? And
Right.
it's almost always positive.
Always positive. And so then I say, "Well, you just felt what it felt like when it came to you. Now you're gonna do the same with someone else. They're gonna feel the same way you feel." So that kind of takes away the fear and they go, "Oh, I never thought of it that way."
Yeah, that's really effective, which just shows, Joel, that you're a good coach. So there's a bunch of these words that you keep
Yes.
saying that are a part of these. So I'm just gonna put these back on the screen because you've said them. The three big ideas here are, and so let's just talk about these briefly. I want to get into some of the specific competencies in a second. You got the three big areas, we'll call them, of executive presence. The first is radiate gravitas. Real quick, what does that mean at a high level?
Gravitas is really about you're coming across as a confident leader and you're in command, meaning you know how to take charge of situations and you have a certain degree of charisma.
Okay.
That's gravitas.
And the second area is act with authority. And what do you mean here?
Means you're someone who comes across with certain behaviors that people see you as being decisive. You know, you act with conviction, you're bold, and you put a stake in the ground and really own your position, and you're influential. You're convincing, compelling, able to persuade people towards a certain point of view. That's authority.
And the third one is more the communication, well, all of it's communication related, but you say express yourself fully. A little bit more on this one before we
So
dive.
expression means you're vocal. You share your thoughts and ideas without hesitation. So you speak up at meetings, and when you do speak up, your second one is insightful. So expression is about being insightful, making good recommendations, asking excellent questions, and the third part is really about clarity. So the key thing about your expression, are you coming across as succinct, to the point, clear, and crisp?
So, as I was preparing for this conversation, Joel, I was trying to do something that I'm not very typically very good at, which is being cynical. And so I was thinking, okay, some of these things uh, there's very little controversy about people being clear. There's very little controversy about people being influential, right? And yet some of the others, maybe there's a little bit more tension, and maybe there's some things that we ought to think about here. Like, is it possible for us to be too commanding or too decisive? I'll just take those two first off of the gravitas line, or excuse me, off of the gravitas line and one off of the authority line. Like, can we be too decisive? Can we be too commanding? What are your thoughts about those? And those, take them separately if you wish.
Yeah, the commanding one I'll start with, and there's a sweet spot of executive presence that lies between being too nice and too aggressive or too commanding. And so the commanding piece, people who don't have executive presence often come across as being too nice but unassertive. But people who possess a high level of certain qualities like commanding and they over pivot with it can come across as arrogant or aggressive. So what we really want is find a sweet spot where we're not being so commanding that it's you're dictating and you're being a dictator almost, You want to have the command, the strength and the confidence behind your ideas, but you don't want to force it so much so that it's too aggressive, it's too much on one side. With the decisive one, the key thing is a lot of times people want to be perfect with their decisions, so they tend to be too indecisive and don't make a decision quickly enough. Now, being too decisive can be you're less collaborative. You're not working with
Right.
people as effectively. And so it's important to sometimes, want to be collaborative and bring people into your decision-making process, but you don't always have to be so decisive that you're ignoring other people's opinions.
Finding that balance between
Balance.
those things.
Yes.
So, the next one I want to talk about briefly is it's kind of like that word presence, although it's even at a higher level with me. Like, often I will hear people say, well, man, charisma, like that's a good thing. Like being charismatic, like maybe there's a downside to that, too much of that, but having charisma, man, I wish I had it, but I didn't. Like that didn't come in my DNA. Like I'm going to go back to what we sort of said about presence. So my question about being charismatic or about having charisma is that really a skill, and what's a skill in that package that will help people get past that? Well, I just didn't get that. I just don't have that one.
I thought you might go there because of all my competencies, the one that people could feel alienated by the most is the charismatic one. And I'll take a leader I'm working with right now. He is working in a biotech industry. He's a scientist, and he is a leader with a lot of influence in the company. He's incredibly soft spoken, one of the most soft spoken voice wise, and his personality. They go hand in hand. He's soft spoken, he's withdrawn, he doesn't speak up very much, he doesn't take much command, he lacks charisma. Now, the thing that we've been working on, and if you break down charismatic into its subcomponents, you could see like, oh, so for example, with this leader, I've worked on could he be more enthusiastic? Could he have a more optimistic attitude? Could he motivate and inspire others more intentionally? Um, could he be more approachable with people? But the key thing with him is could he raise his voice? Could he project more? Could he have more enthusiasm behind his ideas? Because his tendency is I have enthusiasm, but I don't express it. So then it's like, how do you get more motivated and more behind your idea and get more enthusiastic behind it and bring more energy behind it?
Right.
That's what we're talking about. So even someone who's so extremely lacks zero charismaticness could still elevate it to some degree. And that's, so I think with charismatic, it don't either easily discount it just because, oh, I'm not that other person over there who naturally has charisma and and I'm not that. Still recognize that, can I as a leader and people who are listening to this, can they sit there and hear themselves and say, could I have more enthusiasm and energy in my voice? Could I get behind some ideas that I'm excited by and let that excitement out? Am I feeling motivated or passionate about something that I'm bringing forward to the team? Is there
And am I
anything in my
sharing
work?
that with others? Am I sharing that excitement and that energy,
Am I
right?
sharing that excitement with others? Because if you did that, charisma is a part of that.
Exactly.
You're
No, I agree.
it's inevitable for it not to show up unless everything someone does in their work, they have some excitement or enthusiasm for. And it's translating that enthusiasm and excitement in a vocal way so that people can feel it. And that's the transmission of charisma.
So let's talk about transmission of all of this stuff, right? Having presence, even that word sort of implies in physical proximity. Like
Mm.
our presence is when we are present with someone else. And now, like a lot of people are leading, working at a distance. So, what's your advice or counsel around all of this when we might be doing it at a distance? We might not be in the same physical location as our team or as our leaders or whatever regularly or even ever.
Yeah, the key thing is it's easy on, let's say, Zoom or in a hybrid working environment, and you're not necessarily physically present. it can be even more important to make sure, how's my voice, how's my body language, how's my tone, am I coming across with some conviction and confidence? How do I punctuate my points? Do I talk in an engaging voice? Am I telling engaging stories? Those all matter. And at the same time, you're looking at, am I speaking up enough in these virtual environments so that my voice, my message, my connection with others is there? So you want to, like, one thing I recommend people doing is put some questions and talking points, prepare for every Zoom call or virtual meeting they're on, and prepare a couple talking points so that when it comes time for those points to be expressed, they're at the top of your mind and you're ready to deliver it. And then you can actually show up and share. Every meeting you attend, you should be speaking up at least twice, every single meeting, so that your presence is felt. And then when you do speak, know what you're talking about. Make sure you're really having strong eye contact, your good facial expressions, and you're really presenting yourself with some authority and confidence so that people can really feel your presence.
One of the things that I've found in doing so much virtually for such a long time, and I've been leading a remote team for well over a decade, but like you, doing all sorts of things like you and I are doing right now, right? So one of the things that you can do is that many times things you're doing virtually, not all, of course, but some of the things you're doing virtually are recorded, right? You have a meeting, it's recorded because not everyone's there. I could, anytime I want, look at this recording as an example, or of a meeting, our team meeting last Friday, and I could watch it again and just watch me to see, like, even my own perception of how
Mm,
am I coming across. Like, there's a
yeah.
difference between me sitting like this and me
Yes.
sitting like this, and and I can see those things on camera where you would never see those for yourself
That's a
in
great
a
point.
face-to-face setting, right? You have the chance, and you can, even although there's a lot of people that say, well, people are getting Zoom fatigue because they're watching themselves, but even in this moment, I'm looking at the camera, or I'm looking in your eyes, and yet I can look over to say, well, okay, does it look like you're sort of paying attention here, Kevin? Does it look like you're showing any energy or not? And that shouldn't be what we're doing all of the time, sort of self-monitoring. And yet we've got a set of cues here that we would never have in a face-to-face
Yes.
setting that we have on a camera.
It's true. That's an excellent point. And it's a good observation that it's one thing to observe yourself during the Zoom call in the moment of looking, hey, how am I coming across right now in this moment? But it's also taking a time in the later and looking at the recording. I think it's a great idea, and say, how did I come across on the points I did express? It's an opportunity to evaluate yourself that we normally don't have.
Right. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask for feedback from others, because it isn't just our perception. As you said at the beginning, this
Yes.
is about how others perceive us and receive our information, and that sort of thing. So it shouldn't be only that, but it seems like that could be a useful thing. So
Yeah.
before we sort of shift gears and start to move into the final phase here, Joel, anything I didn't ask that you wished I had?
Um, No, I think you asked a lot of great things. I think the key thing is I really want people to show up with all their power and presence, because I find too often the leaders I'm coaching come to me, and what I notice is that they feel like they're being either held back because of their culture, because of their work environment, because of their personality, because of where they're from and who they are. And part of me is like, I want the company to maximize the talent of their employees, and I want the employees to feel fully engaged and feel like they're getting the most out of their work environments. And I feel like executive presence can be a key component of saying, how do I step into my own power, convey confidence, and really lead with conviction? And here's an opportunity of how to do that. So that's one thing I really do care about and want people to have that opportunity.
We're talking with Joel Garfinkle, talking about his new book, Executive Presence. Here it is. If you're watching, you can see it. And if you're not, we'll get you more information about that in a second. But before we do that, Joel, what do you do for fun?
I like to work out. I like to spend time with my family. I like walking my dog outdoors and being outdoors and connecting with nature. Those are some of the things I enjoy a lot.
And I'm pretty confident, like me, that you also read. So my question is, what is it that you're reading these days, or what's something that you've read recently that people might want to know more about?
I read a book that always has stayed with me, and it comes to mind as you ask the question, and that is a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese monk, and it's called Peace is Every Step. And it's really about mindfulness and being present. And I find that it's a very tangible book with a lot of practical ways to be more mindful and more self-aware and more present in your day-to-day life.
Peace is every step. And so we'll have that in the show notes, as well as a link to this book, Executive Presence by Joel Garfinkle. So the question is, where can we learn more? Get the book, that sort of thing. Like, where do you want to point people? Where can we learn more about all the good stuff that you're doing these days?
So the Executive Presence book, you can get it on Amazon. It was voted best leadership book of 2022, #1 Amazon bestseller. So you can get it on Amazon. You want to reach out to me directly. My website is garfinkleexecutivecoaching.com. And you can email me from the website. And any questions you have, you're reading the book and you have some questions or thoughts, I always respond back to all emails and would love to talk to you. I also have over 300 articles and about 25 specific articles on executive presence on my website. So there's a lot of content and information that's valuable for people to get access of and help them in their careers.
Garfinkle, executivecoaching.com. If you're watching, you see it on the screen, but if not, we'll say it again so you can get it written down. Garfinkle, executivecoaching.com. There you go. Thank you so much for being with us, Joel. But before we finish, I've got a question I'm going to ask everybody else. It's the question I ask you all every single week, every single episode. And the question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? What insight did you get today that you're going to go take action on yet today or tomorrow, depending on when you happen to be watching or listening? Did you get something about the balance of commanding that's useful for you? Did you learn something about how you can be more vocal or the choice to do that? Did you get an insight about how we can move beyond our existing tendencies into leaning into having more presence? What did you take from this that you can that will help you be a more effective leader, a more influential leader, a leader with greater presence? And so, Joel, thanks again for being here. Such a pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm glad we finally got it to happen.
Thank you, Kevin.
And so, everybody, thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure to have you, whether you've been with us live or you're listening to it on the podcast later. Know that we're here every week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So make sure you come back, make sure you subscribe and like us, and you know how to do all those things. Share this with a friend, and we'll see you next week on another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.